Earlier this month, Russia announced that they are planning to modernize a huge number of T-62 tanks, and there is a lot to be said about that. The modernized T-62s will receive thermals and improve protection with explosive reactive armor, among other things. According to some reports, they will be modernizing a huge number of 800 T-62 tanks from their reserves. Now, does this mean that Russia is running out of tanks? Well, no, of course not. First of all, the number of 800 that a lot of people have clinged to is wrong. They will not be modernizing 800 T-62 tanks. You see, the number of 800 is the number of all tanks that they will be modernizing in the 3-year plan. This plan does not include only T-62s. The original report comes from the news report where Andrei Gurolev, former commander and a current member of the Russian State Duma, said that they will be modernizing 800 tanks at the 103rd BTRZ factory, which is a factory in the far east of Russia, tasked with refurbishing tanks. But this time, as he says, tanks will not only be refurbished, but modernized. And he took T-62s that were currently in the factory as an example. What came from that is that everyone assumed that the factory will only be modernizing T-62 tanks, which is not the case. In the factory, the workers were also seen working on T-80B tanks, which are probably also the part of the modernization plan. It is not clear how many T-62s will be modernized, but you have to keep in mind that Russia has kept a big reserve of T-62M tanks in the running condition for decades and stationed them in the Far East, pretty close to this factory. So on top of being close by and in perfect condition, these tanks also have access to a big stockpile of the 115mm ammunition. All of that makes them a pretty decent candidate for modernization. Also, these tanks are not new. Back in 2021, there was information about T-62Ms receiving thermals and being offered to some customers. And on top of that, T-62M with thermals was also shown on the Army Forum this year, as a demonstration for potential buyers. And it just happens that the customer is the Russian army. Also, the fact that this one distant factory in the Far East is working on this assignment means that the production of the tanks in the western part is unhindered, and we see more and more reports of the T-80BVM and T-90M tanks being delivered to the Russian army. Now, what about the upgraded T-62s themselves? Well, they aren't really good. The tanks are upgraded with one PN96MT02 sight that apparently has second generation thermal and a laser rangefinder, hence why the big laser rangefinder has been removed from the turret's front. This is the same sight that we have seen on the tank that was presented on the Army Forum. Now, the hull has both the basic T-60M armor and Contact 1 ERA mounted over it, which makes it okay against some older threats, but the turret only has Contact 1 ERA so far from the pics we have seen. This would only work against old RPG-7 rockets and light AT launchers like 84. On top of that, the coverage on the turret is not the best. I don't know if this is the only turret we will see or if they will also use the T-60M turret with extra armor. And on top of everything, it's not a modern tank in any way. It was modernized in the past, but slapping thermal on it does not make it modern in any way. The protection and fire control system are more on the level of the tanks 30 years ago. Of course, that does not mean it would be an absolute failure in battle, far from it, but it is definitely not a tank I'd like to drive into battle with. All of this being said, keep in mind that Russia still has a huge number of T-72 and T-80 tanks in storage. And as I said before, it does appear that some T-80 tanks will also be modernized in this factory. Some have said that these tanks are intended for the Luhansk and the Donetsk People Republic, but the pictures we have seen are from the training of the Russian reservists, which confirms that these tanks are actually intended for the Russian army. All in all, the tanks don't seem to be the best, but modernizing them does kinda make sense when we look at the bigger picture. And their modernization does not mean that Russia is running out of tanks, far from it. It would take years to drain their entire storage. Look at it this way, they have been using everything from T-72A to T-90M, and have lost every possible variant they could have thrown out there, including something as rare as the T-80U with the Drost active protection system. So sending these modernized T-62s into the war would probably make very little difference when it comes to the performance of their tank fleet, since it hasn't been performing great anyway. And it would be better to keep newer and more modern tanks for future modernizations, than to keep wasting them in this war. Of course, it would be best if the actual war would stop. That will be all. If you like my content, you can consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.